Thanks, Sean. And thank you to Jeff Rosen and the National Constitution Center for inviting us here, and also to Clay Risen and his colleagues at the New York Times for the great adventure of the Disunion series. It felt for a while, especially in the first year of the series, I felt sort of like I was addicted to writing for that series for a while, addicted to living in the 1860s. And I went back recently, I counted up that I'd written 73 pieces in that first year, which sort of made me feel like I really was addicted to it. But as Ted just mentioned, we just went through, Jeff kindly took us through the wonderful exhibition on 1968. Have many of you seen that? Here, it's just fantastic. And as I went through it, I couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu, or almost sort of double déjà vu, as we went through and we saw the military apparatus from Vietnam and these TVs that were old vintage TVs blaring Walter Cronkite's reports from the Tet Offensive in 1968. And as I looked at this, it seemed like I was also maybe looking at another 60s moment, the 1860s moment, when violence suddenly seemed to explode out of the heart of our country, when old dogmas and old institutions seemed to be crumbling almost overnight, and when new freedoms seemed to be springing up equally quickly, and also when new media were bringing these developments, bringing war into people's homes, into their living rooms in a way that they had never been seen before. And in fact, now that I mention it, perhaps in some ways there are similarities to our own time as well. So, as Sean said, if you look at an example of this new media that Judy Giesberg was kind enough to bring, and that all of you have that front page of the Inquirer, my hometown paper, by the way, from June 17th, 1863. This is a newspaper that is unlike anything that you would have seen if you had picked up an American newspaper just 10 or 20, let alone 30 years before. These headlines that scream out from the front page, the maps, the dispatches that came by telegraph, all of these brought a kind of immediacy of politics and immediacy of war and of the news itself to people around the country in a way that could never have been experienced before. For instance, in 1775, when at Lexington was fired, of course, the famous shot heard round the world. Well, they call it the shot heard round the world, but it took months for that shot even to echo around the American colonies, let alone around the world. Whereas you can see in 1863, all that had changed. The telegraph, cheap printing, new engraving techniques brought the war, and not just verbally, but also visually, onto people's breakfast tables. So you can see that this main headline in the Inquirer sort of screams the news. I mean, almost like, I don't know, Bill O'Reilly style or something like that. Just deck after deck of rally, Pennsylvania invaded, the people coming to the rescue, followed by, I counted, a 17-deck headline. Amazing. And then a little bit further down, you see a line of much finer print that strikes shame into my heart, which is the line, "Philadelphia has not responded." Sorry. But in fact, the panic, as Sean suggested, was spreading across much of Pennsylvania. Harrisburg was being evacuated, bank deposits were being removed, state archives were being moved to Philly, and intrepid volunteers were digging trenches around the city of Pittsburgh, if not Philly. The roads of southern Pennsylvania were crammed with carriages and wagons of people trying to escape. Now, meanwhile, down in Washington, D.C., where the President of the United States and his cabinet, just like other Americans, were trying to follow this news by any means possible and through these new technologies, a member of Lincoln's cabinet, Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, who was also quite an active diarist during the Civil War, that evening, June 17th, exactly 150 years ago, he went down to the War Department, which was where the telegraph office was housed. I think those of you who saw the movie Lincoln remember that scene in the telegraph office, wonderful scene. And Lincoln and Secretary Stanton were there, as they were on many nights and days during the war. And these rumors were coming in from all sides, and Wells was quite worried. But when he went into the telegraph office, immediately a jovial Stanton assured him that it was all false rumors, that the rebels hadn't even entered Pennsylvania yet. And Wells also wrote in his diary that night, the president was in excellent humor. And Lincoln was talking all about how, in fact, this alleged invasion of Pennsylvania, was going to be fodder for his favorite comedian, his favorite writer of political satire. No sooner did Lincoln get on the subject of comedy than he started telling his favorite McClellan joke that he just heard, which was something about a monkey and a snake that I didn't really get, so I won't tell it now. But anyway, clearly in Washington they were, to say the least, misinformed. Meanwhile, in the field, the Army wasn't much better off. That same day, General Hooker, who was commanding the Army of the Potomac, at least for the next few days, wrote to Henry Halleck, the General-in-Chief, and asked Halleck, back in Washington, what's going on? What's Lee up to? And Halleck writes back to Hooker later that same day, so far, we have only the wild rumors of panic-stricken people. That was all they had. Clearly, the military intelligence at this time was lacking. But in fact, there was reason for people to be panicking, especially, as Sean mentioned, in the North, where the Union armies in Virginia were deep into their third unsuccessful summer campaign of the war, and morale was seriously flagging for many reasons. There had been huge anti-war rallies, including in New York at the Cooper Union just a couple of weeks earlier. And people were saying terrible things in this press, in this new media of the 1860s, terrible things not just about the Confederates, but about the Union leaders. On June 17th, there was one newspaper that wrote, "The Tsar of Russia or the Emperor of Austria never claimed or exercised more unlimited powers than King Lincoln." And this was a newspaper, I might add, not in one of the border slave states where you might expect it, but a newspaper in Maine, deep as you can get into Yankeedom. And there's news also from even farther afield, overseas, that's a bit discouraging. For instance, that month the French troops were sweeping through Mexico on their way to topple the Mexican government in Mexico City and soon to set up this Habsburg puppet emperor on the throne. So there was a feeling that this whole fabric of freedom, not just in the United States, but in the Americas, was sort of unraveling all over. This invasion that had happened because, of course, the United States was seen as too powerless to enforce the Monroe Doctrine in the middle of its crisis. Now, meanwhile, all of these headlines from across the North were being followed by one very wily Southerner, Mr. Robert E. Lee, who was a general who, I think it's not always appreciated, understood not just the power of the sword, but also the power of the pen, or you might say the power of these new high-speed printing presses, the new journalism and the telegraph that was carrying the news, carrying rumor, and carrying, as we see, panic faster than ever before. Lee, I think, understood that a propaganda war indeed was being fought, and that it was this war, as much as the war on the battlefields, that was important for the South to win. I think Lee understood something that we sort of forget today. Looking through our hindsight, our vision from 150 years later, and we know how the Civil War, you do know that the South lost the Civil War, right? Okay, I don't want to spoil anything. Knowing how the Civil War turned out and that the South lost, we tend to think of them as the underdog. But in fact, the Confederacy had a much easier job, had in some ways an upper hand over the Union, because, of course, the Union needed to win the war, to destroy the political and military apparatus of the Confederate rebellion. The Confederacy didn't need to destroy the Union. The Confederacy didn't need to, in a sense, win the war. The Confederacy simply had to not lose the war. So every month and every year that Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and the others could hang on, they were ever closer to victory, almost no matter what was happening on the battlefield. And Lee was planning a sort of a two-pronged propaganda attack. And I really think he was thinking about propaganda as much as of military victory. He was planning, on the one hand, that this invasion of Pennsylvania would deal a final mortal blow to Union morale. At the same time, he was urging President Jefferson Davis to open up peace negotiations with the Lincoln administration, sort of leading them on to think that the Confederacy was proposing a plan of honorable reunion, but actually thinking, well, once these negotiations are underway and we've won this victory in the North, the Unionists will really lose heart and will really be, they'll really be ready to capitulate. So this is the battle that was being fought besides the battle that would be decided on the field. And of course, the moment of truth as of June 17th was less than 2 weeks away. Judy? Judy?
So thank you. I'll add my thank yous to everybody else's thank yous for having us all here. And for some of you who've been reading the blog, thank you for reading it and adding your comments. It's been a really great way to interact with people and in a very immediate way. So my job is, as I understand it, is to sort of take us to a sort of microscopic level and talk about, I want to talk in particular about one Philadelphian who experienced the war, because that's something that I've been working on. And I think it helps us to understand Philadelphia, the experience of Philadelphians in the war. So for about a year and a half now, I've been working with a group of graduate students at Villanova to transcribe and annotate a diary of a young African-American woman who lived in Philadelphia during the Civil War. Her name is Emily Davis. Her name was. I'm also seem to be living in the 1860s too. It's an unusual source, and we first became interested in it because the first diary that still exists, whether or not it's her first one, we don't know, begins on January 1st, 1863, the day the Emancipation Proclamation came into effect. So as we started to read the diary, we found that despite this presidential proclamation, what the diary was teaching us was that emancipation was really an open question, even after the proclamation came into effect. In Emily's diary, her faith in emancipation rises and falls with Lincoln's political future, and really with the fate of the Union Army. And I think that that's not necessarily news for people, but it reminds you that for people of color, in living in the North during the Civil War, they were keenly interested in the outcome of emancipation. And clearly for people, those people who were actively seeking their freedom in the South, people of color in the South who were seeking their freedom, emancipation wasn't a done deal. There's not one day during the war when they felt like it was effectively over, and we get that sense even from a free black woman living in Philadelphia. Every day, it's a different trial for her. She has to be reminded, she has to remind herself that we're in the process. The emancipation is this process. Each day we read her diary, she's either worried or joyful. She's either celebrating the fate of emancipation or she's worried about the fate of emancipation, and sometimes she does that in the same day. She's reading the newspapers along with everybody else in Philadelphia, and the news is coming pretty fast by the end of the war, so she can find several editions of the Philadelphia Inquirer by the time at the end of the war, so she can have those different emotions within one given day. What is fascinating about this source, and many of the sources I think that have been highlighted on the Disunion blog, is that you really get the raw immediacy of the events. Lived through the eyes of someone who doesn't know the outcome of them. And it's really exhilarating, and I hope some of you who've been reading the blog have got that experience too. The people who are producing these documents that are being profiled in the blog, they don't know how it's going to come out. And certainly this diarist who I've been working on doesn't. I wanted to read, just to get a sense of how Philadelphians like Emily Davis are experiencing the war. I wanted to read just a couple of her diary entries for starting today and for the next couple of weeks, so we can get a sense of what it felt like on the ground in Philadelphia, starting tonight and going forward until the end of the Gettysburg campaign. If you want to read the rest of the diary, you can go to www.davisdiaries.villanova. .edu. You can read the whole diary and you can live it through her eyes. So I'll start with a couple of these diary entries, and then I'll talk about those a little bit more. There are really two things that Emily Davis is most worried about in starting mid-June through till the end of the Gettysburg campaign, and that is the Confederates who are invading the state and the safety of her relatives who live not only in Philadelphia, but also in Harrisburg and other locales that would be in the line of potentially come in contact with the Confederates. And the second thing that she's most interested in is black enlistment, because she is attending a black school in Philadelphia where many of the young men are attempting to enlist. And we can see these things highlighted in her diary. So I'll just give you a little flavor of this diary. Tuesday, June 23rd, 1863, Emily attends school and a meeting, and she writes in her diary, "I feel so worried about father." And Emily's father lives in Harrisburg. Monday, June 29th, 1863, Emily wrote a letter to her father and then wrote in her diary, "Today has been a most exciting day. I have witnessed refugees are coming in from all towns this side of Harrisburg." Tuesday, June 30th, 1863, Emily writes, "The greatest excitement prevails. I am most sick worrying about father. The city is considered in danger." Wednesday, July 1st, the first day of fighting in the little town of Gettysburg, doesn't go well for the Union Army. Emily doesn't even mention Gettysburg, but it's there in her thoughts with everything she says. This is what she writes in her diary that day. "The excitement is not quite so great today. Vincent is perfectly wild with excitement. All the boys have volunteered." So in those couple of diary entries that you've seen, what's foremost in her mind, and for many black Philadelphians like her who have families, members of their family who live elsewhere in the state or even in Philadelphia, they're concerned about the safety of their family members. Black communities are intimately familiar by this time with what invasion meant. They had been fending off what had been a long invasion that by 1861 they had been engaged with slave catchers. They had been defending white Philadelphians, and white Pennsylvanians had been defending their black neighbors from kidnapping really since the 1830s. This is a really long history by the time the war begins, and this is not news to anybody who's living along any black Pennsylvanians living along the southern border. They're used to engaging with slave catchers, but they're also keenly worried about this new invasion and what it will mean for the safety of their families. So when residents of South Central Pennsylvania read news like you see in your newspaper there, that the Confederates are heading toward the border, they might have anticipated what would happen next. They knew probably before anybody else knew that meant that the Confederates were going to be taking people back into slavery. They were going to be kidnapping African Americans and bringing them into slavery. And we don't know how many black Pennsylvanians were taken during the Gettysburg campaign. Historians estimate somewhere between 200 and 300 black Pennsylvanians simply disappear during the weeks that the Confederate Army is making their appearance in Pennsylvania, and they're either imprisoned or sold. But many more of them flee their homes. And we can see this in the newspaper article that you have. I think it's one of them mentions Harrisburg. There's a Harrisburg Letter on June 17th. If you have really good eyes, you can see the headline in the middle, "Our Harrisburg Letter." From Harrisburg, they start to hear about refugees, people who are fleeing the advancing Confederate Army, taking whatever they could, leaving their homes, trying to go to Harrisburg, or later on during the month, winding up in the streets of Philadelphia. People with just a few personal belongings on them, who knew that or felt like they would be safer in Philadelphia than they would be standing in the way of Lee's army. For black Pennsylvanians, what's fascinating about this, when you live the Civil War on a day-by-day basis, Gettysburg is not a 3-day battle. It's really a 3-week-long saga when they're nervous about what the outcome will be and which of their family members they might not ever see again. So her first consideration, or her first concern, Emily Davis's, is for the security of people of color in the state of Pennsylvania. Her second interest, and the thing that shows up in these 3 weeks that she's writing about the Gettysburg campaign, is Black enlistment. On Monday, June 15th, Emily wrote a letter to her brother, who was serving in the US Navy by this point, visited friends, and then she wrote in her diary, "I saw a company of colored recruits. They looked quite warlike," she says. And then on Tuesday, June 16th, she writes about all of her friends who are enlisting, and she's worried about them. She doesn't know what that means, all of them. Does that mean her friends? Does that mean her colleagues, her teachers at her school? And then on June 18th, when about 150 men of color from Philadelphia got on trains and went to Harrisburg to volunteer to defend the state, among them Octavius Cato, who some of you probably have heard. Emily writes in her diary, "Today has been the most exciting day I ever witnessed." And you can see that a lot. Every day is the most exciting day because it just gets more exciting each day. "We went to see the boys start for Harrisburg," she writes. "I left home about 11 o'clock. It was almost 12 in the morning when I came home." Then on Friday, June 19th, she writes, "The first thing I heard was that the boys had been sent back. I feel glad and sorry." And that last line, of course, means when the men showed up in Harrisburg, they were turned back because the state of Pennsylvania still did not accept Black recruits. Ironically, right, the Confederate Army is coming into the state. They're desperate to get people to defend the state. Philadelphians don't seem to be worried about defending the state, and Black Philadelphians who do come out to volunteer are turned away. So what do we learn from Emily Davis's diary entries about Black recruitment? Well, for starters, what we learn is that she's up late at night, she's attending meetings, she's watching men drill, she's worried about people's safety. Those are things that are common for all diarists writing during the war. And it's, of course, deeply frustrating, too. You can imagine for her friends and her colleagues, her family members who are trying to enlist. Massachusetts, a lot of you, I'm sure know, you saw the movie Glory, right? Massachusetts accepted Black men into regiments starting in January. They started enrolling Black men as Union soldiers. Pennsylvania wouldn't do so until after the Gettysburg invasion was over. Right? Ironically, by the end of June, Philadelphia is a nexus for Black enlistment, with not only Camp William Penn out in Cheltenham, Massachusetts, but also the school for training the white officers of Black troops right on Chestnut. That's where that school was. So you sort of see that startling change within those few weeks of the Gettysburg campaign. Black men churn out, they go to Harrisburg, they're sent back by Governor Curtin, but by the end of June, Philadelphia is a really important part of Black recruitment. Of course, as those Black recruits head out to Harrisburg and are